Up and running, up and gunning. Sticky Stocky Sweet TV, Keith Gorgon. Cassava, passava, mind over matter, up and running. Yeah, man, so the last version of this, because I never really put it out, make everybody really put out them things. I not really rush nothing. Come tell me time, I'm hold it. So I put out my second hearing of the Vybz Kartel trial at the Privy Council. Well, it's not really a trial, it's a hearing anyway for appeal. Okay? So this is the second hearing. So it's day two. You have day one and day two. So this is day two. Because remember, this is a long whole day thing. So we have to pick out the bits them and edit out the bits them for 30 minutes. Forget the real part of what we are dealing with. Because there's so much video them do. People think say, well, then Privy Council is just like, there's a lot of whole heap of shit where you don't want to, when it makes sense sometimes. When I really, the public now go really understand. So it's a lot of work to go through them and edit out where it's really what makes sense to people. Anyway, we do that. So this is our part two. But there's one thing in this part two, people. May I tell you, you can see Paul Llewellyn. Because sometimes our name so get my thing twist up all the while. It's like, it's a shame, I don't understand. Anyway, the DPP top woman, Paul Llewellyn. Anyway, people, stay with me, because that woman really is a crisis. But anyway, you can see her at the corner. It's like, I don't know, because I think she would have wet herself somehow or the other. Because you can see her, so she well in trouble. And at that me really look on. So just watch her, people. Watch her, and because we are watch her, And all our team, them nervous. You can see it, the body language and everything. But I'm saying, that you call this karma, She go like she in a big thing at Jamaica and rate and Lele, because especially in the Andrew Wellness lead government, she go and say, well, then she is the king woman or the queen woman at Jamaica. Anything she say goes. You remember that woman, some things what she do? She let her flight green, when them the COVID way, boom, them break the code and things like that. And I go like them exempt and things like that, and I ball out shower and I drink champagne and all these things and now distant themselves. You remember that? I just had that day that happened really still, And that is a clear breach. Look what happened in England with Boris Johnson. He must resign. Right? The England Prime Minister have to resign. And that the Minister Clive Flight Green just get a little slap on him wrist and put him one side for a few weeks and then a few months and then them promote him again. And no man said there's no case to answer. Yeah, the next one beat him on the stool again. And the same thing. They put evidence. They put video as evidence. No charge. Remember Azina King, what she want to name, McLaren and the girl with them trim her ear. Can't remember her right name, but her last name is King. Can't get familiar with the first name. But anyway, people don't want to know who me talk. That girl with them trim her ear, and this woman will come out and say, well then, and the girl pop out her ear herself, and there's no case, and then a bigger thing they ruling and say, well then, so she getting licked left, right, and center. This woman try to cover everything. Once it's poor people, she put them down. Put down Ninja Man, put down Vybz Kartel with all kind of different evidence that really makes sense, people. And it's a tell upon her right, because as I'm saying, because them really want to put away somebody, them couldn't go with the evidence that them have and see if them get a result. So what them do, them tamper with the thing, same speed, just to get him away. I see now, them in a trouble. Them in a trouble. Because as I see the Privy Council, because this Privy Council in England and around, them people, you can't have jury corrupt. And you have unbalanced jury, all them things that I think you can get. No. So you have to big up Isaac Buchanan again. Isaac Buchanan, I set. Because me always call him Isaac, you know. But it's Isaac Buchanan. It's a Rasta name, a big youth game, because a big youth son in it. So you have to big up the brother there still, because he's a poor people governor and I do the right thing. Because nobody else now going to take up them appeal case, you know. And I hope when this come out in German time, will come again, right straight after this. Because that woman have to sink and she have to repent. Believe you me. Because the wicked is showing her face right through her little gap teeth them. But anyway, people, when we want to take a look, just watch her how she nervous. I mean, how she wet herself somehow or the other. Yeah, man, she just sit down there and she's like nobody there. And all of these little this fat guy on the right hand side. Just look at his face, him under him jaw. And all time people say, you know, don't take all time people if you know tie, you know. All time people say when you put your hand on your jaw, a fret, you're a fret. So this man under him jaw, most of the time, right through when that man attack, you know, when the guy who defend them attack. So him know say well then him not really bright. The other Vybz Kartel people who defend him more bright and they judge them. So it's gonna be a bangarang. It's gonna be a really roller coaster case. Cause me couldn't bet money and say, well then, Kartel go work. And to be truthful, me not see no retrial in this. Because that them want to go for now. Because you can't have a case like this and you got to talk about retrial. You know what I mean? We have so much bumpy and patty hole in it with these people. That's what they do, man. And God now sleep, you know. And you have a thing named karma. And that come around right now. So it's a joy to watch this. Just watch her face, people. Just watch her face and the nervousness upon her. How them really nervous. The whole bench. As they say, you know, fire down most steel, don't think a cool breeze. And that means see what go on right as I know. But you know, without no further ado still, I will get to the video. Because it's this is called bangarang. And you up now. Anyway, people, give me for those that slipped up. Because sometimes I'm saying when I'm trying to call out a woman's name, pronounce her name, call her name, it's always mixed up. I don't know if because she's that evil. And it must be that, you know. Some of them be supposed to not really call her name. But, you know, I'm going to say the name is Paula Llewellyn. Paula Llewellyn. So I kind of get it right. So, what is the DP? Yo, we have to laugh, you know. No, seriously, you know, we always have problem calling a woman a name for some reason or the other. But anyway, the DPP, you know, head of the justice system at Jamaica, she honor fire people, she honor the weather. And I just want, during this year when I'm watching the video, just take a look and watch her. Just watch this woman and watch the nervousness and watch the sin and everything with upon her. Because she knows she do something wrong. Yeah, man. Anyway, without no further ado, here goes. Boom.
Good morning, my lords, my lady. I would just like first to return to the point about was the jury quorate, if I can put it that way. Was it quorate? Was there a quorate jury? Nothing to do with unfairness of the trial as such, purely were there sufficient members on that jury when the verdict was reached on a proper view of what the Juries Act requires. And my submission is this. On a proper construction of the Jury Act, there is no automatic disqualification of a juror just because he is said by another to have been acting improperly in the performance of his duties. The discharge, though it is only when he is actually discharged from the jury that the number of jurors is reduced. And my lords, overnight, my lady, overnight, Mr. Turnbull and I dug up the entire Juries Act, because in my submission one does need to see the structure of it. When I say entire Juries Act, it's not very big. It goes back to 1892. But in my submission, when one looks at the structure of the Juries Act and what it is talking about, it is plain, in very summary terms, that there is a public duty on people to act as jurors. If you qualify to be a juror, then you must act as a juror, and it is only when you are discharged that you cease to be. There are certain requirements for qualification, such as, for instance, mental capacity and so forth. But my short point is, once you're on that jury, you are one of their number until you are actually discharged. But I can deal with it quite briefly, and we sent it over this morning. It goes back to, the Act goes back, I think, to 1892. If you look at, I'm not quite sure what numbering you're adopting, but if you look at, as it were, the opening page of the Act, this Act may be cited as the Jury Act, you'll see it goes back to, it says, 1962 at the top, and indeed, but that's the edition of laws, but you'll see under the heading, the Jury Act, 7th of July, 1898.
Sorry.
And that's why I say this is essentially a public duty. Then Section 7, you have the provision as to how jury lists are made up. I don't propose to read that out, but there's a provision for making up of jury lists. And Section 8 gives further details as to how the jury list is to be drawn up, essentially by justices. And then Section 10, it shall be lawful for the justices at such sessions to strike out of such lists the names of all persons shown to their satisfaction to be not qualified or not liable to serve on juries, or to be dead, or disabled by mental capacity, deafness, blindness, or other permanent infirmity. So this is the way, as it were, you are removed from a list. And then B, to add to such lists the names of any other person, and then C, to correct errors. My Lord, I do apologise.
I appreciate you don't bear sole responsibility for this, Mr. Knox, by any means, but it's quite important that we actually have the legislation that was enforced at the time of the trial.
My Lord, absolutely.
Yeah.
My Lord, can I say one of the difficulties, this wasn't a point, of course, that was raised in the appellant's grounds and so forth, so it has been a bit of a rush, and I do apologise. It does look as if...
We don't need to be rushed. We can adjourn for some minutes if that's going to give you time to get hold of a copy of the correct version of the Jury Act.
As in force at that time.
You were
not always that easy from my experience. One has to dig back a bit. But can I just say this, certainly for the time being, the point I'm making, I'm assuming, as everyone has assumed, that a jury of 11 was a sufficient number, but it couldn't go below 11. That appears to have been common ground throughout the trial, and indeed in the Court of Appeal, as I understand it. So that's the premise. You can't go below 11. The point I'm on, in one sense, is not whether or not you can go below 11, but what is the nature of a jury? And the nature of a jury, in my submission, is simply there are 11 members on it. And if there are 11 members on it, you've got a quorum. Even if, for some reason, one or other of the jurors is acting improperly, or there's reason to suppose he's acting improperly. As long as he's on the jury, he is one of their number. And it's only when he's discharged that the jury number is reduced. So, my Lord, that's what I say. So it is in theory possible, it would in theory be possible for a juror after the event who's kept, or for it to be discovered after the event, that a juror has been bribed, he's kept it to himself, and for the court then to investigate. But in my submission, in those circumstances, the court would still say, even though the juror had been bribed, let us say, the jury was quorate. On the facts...
Well, why do you say that? Because in normal circumstances, if this came to light, that particular juror would be discharged.
I agree with that, normally.
So the whole system wouldn't come to a halt?
In circumstances such as this. I agree with that, because you could discharge a juror, but in circumstances such as this, it would bring automatic. If my learned friend's right, there's an automatic. It just comes to an end. Full stop. I submit that cannot be right. There is still a power in the court, as long as a fair trial can be ensured. There is still a power in the court to allow the trial to go ahead. And in my submission, the next question then is, well, did the judge exercise, or can it be said the judge exercised his discretion wrongly and perversely in allowing the trial to go ahead? That is the correct question, focusing on the position as it was before the trial judge when the And in my submission, the trial judge, it'd be wrong to interfere with the trial judge's exercise of discretion for the following reasons. First, as things stood, it was a mere allegation, no doubt one which appeared to be supported by strong evidence, but it would not be practicable at that point to carry out an investigation of the corrupt juror himself. That couldn't seriously have been done, and what is more, my lord, I might add, although he was found guilty of attempting to pervert the course of justice, he did in fact plead not guilty. One just wonders, well, what in real life? What benefit would that have done? How could the judge have taken matters further? He had it on the word of the forewoman that she had told the jurors that they weren't to take any notice of this, and in my submission, that was good enough. What was to be gained by the judge asking each and every juror what their position was? Secondly, in my submission, the judge was entitled to take into account the view expressed by the forewoman that none of the 10 jurors had accepted the bribe. That's an important point. He's entitled to take that into account and say that, well, that sounds true to me, and that she, the forewoman, had told the others that they must abide by their oath. It's obvious that the judge was impressed by the forewoman, and he will have seen her, and he will have to form a judgment as to whether she's a trustworthy person. And he's entitled, in my submission, to take that into account. Third, he was entitled to take into account, A, his own directions so far, and I'll come to those in a moment, B, his assessment of the jurors over the 56 days of trial so far, especially this, my lord, it is evident they had acted on his repeated warnings not to talk to anyone, despite the obvious temptation of doing so in such a high-profile trial, and C, he was entitled to take into account that he could give a further direction that could be given to remedy any prejudice to the accused. Now, I'll come to that direction, if I may, in a moment, but just before he goes back into court, he's entitled to say to himself, it is proper for me to carry on with this trial, because I can ensure that a fair trial will happen, bearing in mind everything that's happened in the case. Thirdly, I emphasise this point. The Court of Appeal, who have a good knowledge of the local circumstances, upheld the way the judge dealt with that. The Court of Appeal saying what was to be gained by questioning the accused juror. And in my submission, that was a perfectly proper approach. I mean, one does ask, what was to be gained by...
But it's an acknowledgement that that juror was not going to abide by his oath, isn't it?
Oath. Well, it's an acknowledgement that he may well not abide by his oath. That is right. I cannot deny that there was obviously a risk, bearing in mind that...
Well, more than a risk, it was...
A likelihood, maybe, so far as one could tell. One only has an allegation. But I come back to the point I made yesterday.
Well, if it was just a risk, then he would have investigated and impressed upon the juror the importance of not being affected by... extraneous considerations.
I can see that, but even if one allows that, you have my submission yesterday, if the risk is just that one, or probability that just that one juror is not going to perform his duty, that in my submission is not a reason for discharging the entire jury if the prosecution, who are affected by that bias, says carry on anyway. And that was one juror is bent against the prosecution, come what may. Let us assume.
But the real problem which we're facing isn't it that there was a risk that the whole of the rest of the jury were biased against the defendant?
My lord, I accept that's a different risk, if I may, for the moment. That is a different risk. But just as far as questioning the individual bad juror, my lord, and that was the point which this particular paragraph is on, I submit that there was nothing to be gained. There was indeed. What's he going to do? He's just going to deny it, probably.
Yes, but it is really the point I think that Lord Burrows was making, but if you read on, saying a great deal would have been lost by questioning the accused juror. And what would have been lost would have been the trial, because if the accused juror had admitted the conduct alleged, then not only he but the entire jury would have had to be discharged.
Well, my lords, I submit he wouldn't necessarily have to discharge the jury, even if, let us say, the individual juror had said, "Oh, I own up." in my submission, he's entitled to do that.
I think the answer that would normally be given is you must discharge that juror.
If of course, I agree with that. In normal circumstances.
So if we assume that the legal position is you must discharge that juror, what is then your submission?
Well, in my submission, if you absolutely must, in all circumstances, even in a case such as this, where you've got right to the end of the trial, you can have a 10-1 verdict, and so forth. If you must, then my lords, I accept. Then what has happened is that the verdict that was given by 10 people who were entitled to be on the board of the panel, and one person who wasn't. And then the consequence of that would be, I suppose, that you do not have a quorate verdict.
The implication of your submission seems to be that in a criminal trial, and you could hardly have a more serious trial than this, where you have 5 people accused of murder. Clearly there's a public interest in a true verdict being returned. The implication of what you're saying seems to be that the judge really has no responsibility in that regard. He's entitled, if the prosecution are willing to run the risk of the jury being nobbled by the corrupt member of the jury, that's a matter for them, and he can go along with that.
My lords, he has to be satisfied that the other 10 won't be nobbled, or it's very unlikely they'll be nobbled. I'd accept that. But if his thinking is, and I submit it was likely to have been this, I've got one bad juror here, I've got good reason to suppose the other 10 will behave properly. That means there will be, the jury will be quorate at 11. In my submission, he is entitled, he is not bound to say, I've got to stop the trial now. He has a power to allow the trial to go ahead. That is, and my lords, I accept that is the kernel of my submission. It has to be one which he exercises not entirely unreasonably in all the circumstances of the case. That is why I'm making the submissions I have been. He may well be able to persuade one of the other jurors, not by offering money.
Well, by offering money.
No.
But he may.
No, he may be able to persuade one of the other jurors in deliberation. Look, forget about my bribe. These people are innocent because of point X. He's still entitled to do that.
Well, he's entitled to do that, but he's not entitled to persuade them by offering them bribes.
Certainly
And that is an ongoing risk.
That is, my lady, I accept that is an ongoing risk.
Yeah.
That must be right, is a risk. He will try again.
Yeah.
I mean, you might think it's a bit unlikely if the matter's been reported to the judge, actually. But there's a possible risk. Let us say there's a possible risk. My lady, even in those circumstances, if that is a risk which the prosecution is prepared to take in order to achieve a verdict, that is the lesser of two evils, and if both the judge and the prosecution think that is a proper way of proceeding, they can. That is my fundamental point. And one of the problems with jury trials is one is trying to create a system of perfection. In one sense, of course this is not perfect. No one would begin to say it's perfect. But is it, in fact, the pragmatic way forward, which did, in the event, secure a fair verdict? That is
but the defendant's counsel didn't accede to this way of proceeding. That they continued to raise well, on the face of it, it looks as if they were objecting.
There's no doubt about that. But they were objecting for different. They weren't objecting on the quorum point, but they were objecting because of the way it's put. I think by one of them is the overcompensation point. I'm concerned about it, and that's a fair point.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's a bad point, but in my submission, it's not a conclusive point. Not to allow feelings of sympathy or prejudice to influence you, cause you to ground your verdict. There's no room for a verdict which has its genesis in sympathy or prejudice. Your verdict must be arrived at on the basis of the evidence and on that basis alone. All this is coming quite early on in the summing up, but it's absolutely emphatic. And just while I'm on the summing up, 4769 is where the judge gives his direction, or the first of his directions, 4769 to 4770, to keep separate, that is to say, consider each of these cases separate. It's an important direction, in the context of this type of case. Now, in my submission, taken in the round, these directions were good enough to ensure that the 10 jurors at least who returned the verdict of guilty did so uninfluenced by the offer, or by the misconduct, rather, of the bribing juror.
Do we see anything in either the judge's appraisal of the problem or in the Court of Appeal's appraisal of the problem of a real weighing of the risk of what I think counsel for the defendants at the time called overcompensation, i.e. a risk that because there had been a widespread attempt to bribe the jury, then the defendants must be guilty?
My lords, I think it's fair to say there is no... well, the judge himself, obviously, he doesn't, because
he's obviously heard the
split decision. Yes, no, he doesn't. No, he just goes ahead. It's a fairly short. The trouble is, it's all dealt with very quickly. It's just a short.
The Court of Appeal don't seem to address their minds to that issue.
Not quite clear to what extent.
You watch Paulo well in.
One of the problems is in the Court of Appeal, as far as one can tell, that doesn't really appear to be the main thrust of the appeal. The thrust of the appeal was more investigation should be made by the judge. The bias point it was there, but it wasn't, so to speak, centre stage. That's my understanding. And so that, no doubt, is why the matter doesn't receive the attention which now it's been subjected to. And the point about the burning of the houses is that this was Palmer's house, and there was no report of any damage being done to the house at all by Palmer, and that was a point that was made to the jury. How come, if he owns the house and it's been damaged or burnt down, or burnt at least, how come he makes no report of it at all? The next category of evidence was Exhibit 14C. That consisted of voice and text messages from Palmer, and they are summarised at E5803 to 5807. And St John said he left the premises just as Chow entered, and he saw Palmer getting bitten by a dog. And that's 4390 to 4392. But the short point is that there was no denial, as far as one could take out, that they were there. And that is significant because the premises are then subsequently destroyed a few days later, or partly destroyed. And there's no explanation for this. Those are my submissions on the main point. I've only got a little bit of time on the other points. I think I'm right to say my lord, you have seen our written case.
Yeah, this is the JS2.
Yes, the JS2 point.
Do you want to hear him on it? Or do you want to go off the bench?
Should we rise for a moment?
Yes. Mr. Knox, we'll rise for a moment or two just to consider whether we need to hear you on the JS2 point.
I'm obliged, my lord.
He accepts that ultimately this jury included, to use his language, a bent juror. In terms of the fair-minded bystander, that immediately must raise eyebrows. But secondly, probably more importantly in one sense, his submissions this morning focused on what whether or not the judge was acting reasonably. That in our submission is not ultimately the key question. The key question is whether or not the fair-minded bystander would effectively conclude there was a real risk of bias. Now, the fair-minded bystander test has been consistently, I'll just give you the references to it, applied by criminal courts. It was applied in Brown, as you saw when I opened, which is at page 6330, paragraph 38. It was also applied, applying Brown in Morrison, which my learned friend took you to, page 7564, paragraph 36. And 31.3 is the provision essentially that talks about a properly constituted jury and makes it clear that if the numbers are not reduced by more than one, the jury remains properly constituted. Well, we would submit that if someone is biased and essentially being discounted by the judge as on the basis that essentially the verdict can be delivered by 10, that is inconsistent with 31.3, but 31.4, even more importantly, in one sense, deals with what a verdict of 11 jurors, a verdict of 11 jurors is treated. It provides that it will be unanimous, essentially, deemed as unanimous, even though one person has been discharged, demonstrating really that the expectation of the legislation is that all jurors will participate. And that's even clearer, we would submit. If you go down in the version that we've got to, it's page 24 within the pagination of the document, section 44(1)(a), which is the provision that allowed a majority verdict. On the material they had, essentially, it was one juror who was approached. He bases his approach on the need for collective and individual integrity. He's making it clear, and we would submit this is consistent with the statutory scheme. The jury system isn't a system where you can say, well, you've got 11 individual actors. He's saying you've got 11 people who have individual responsibilities, but they also act as a collective. And that's what the legislation is plainly intended to represent. And that is reflected, I won't take you back to it, in the Baychandan decision that we produced yesterday from the Guyanan Court of Appeal. It explains why a trial without its full numbers can't be regarded as a valid trial, even though in principle it might have been possible to proceed with the number that was who were actually involved in the verdict. And fundamentally there is a good reason for that, and it's this. Everyone remembers, most lawyers remember very strongly 12 Angry Men. And it's the point about that is you can have one member of the jury who is completely out of line with everybody else, who persuades everybody. And your right is to have that one person come forward. And one of the real risks in these circumstances is that the corrupt juror, my learned friend, because he needs this, has to accept that the corrupt juror can participate. It's potentially important he participates because he might be the minority, the person who is going to try and persuade everybody else that he's right on the evidence. But of course, there is then a problem because all the other jurors, if they're aware of this, may well, understandably, want to discount his views perfectly properly in one sense, you would think. But that's the fundamental problem that you've got in this case. And that's one of the reasons why you can't separate this, because you can't separate the questions in the way that my learned friend does, because he needs to say, because he needs the corrupt juror to remain on the jury, that corrupt juror needs to be able to participate in principle in the decision making, but it's very difficult to see how they can do that without then there being a problem. And all of that statutory scheme obviously needs to be viewed in light of the fact that there is a right under the Charter, Section 16, to an independent and impartial tribunal. We would submit it's impossible for this court, many years after the event, with transcripts but not much else essentially, to assess the extent to which the jury would inevitably have discounted, because of the strength of the evidence, prejudicial material. In any event, fundamentally, that explains why there is a right to trial by an independent jury, because it's for the jury to assess facts. What my learned friend's submissions do is potentially undermine that right, and that explains why all the authorities demonstrate essentially that the proviso doesn't apply. What my learned friend was seeking to do in my submission was seeking to apply the proviso, having accepted later in his submissions that the proviso can't apply to an unfair trial. Well, if it's a biased jury, you have an unfair trial. And that's entirely consistent with Serafin as well, because it clearly, if the jury was unlawful because it was biased or indeed didn't comply with the Jury Act, Serafin paragraph 49 in our submission makes it clear the verdict can't be upheld. In terms of directions, Bonnet-Taylor in our submission reflects the approach in Smith that directions must be apposite, clear and emphatic. The reference to Smith I gave in opening, it's 7671 paragraph 24. The direction in Bonnet-Taylor that was upheld at 629024 was a specific direction.
Sorry, 6290.
6290 paragraph 24. And that's the context of what followed, which was the assumption that the jury would follow the direction. It's important to note, however, that paragraph 25, the statement that there is an assumption that the jury will follow a direction, was then followed by paragraph 26, which started with the word however, making it clear there was a degree of qualification, that emphasised the importance of the protocol, the need to investigate, because you can't, in one sense, rely on a direction until you're satisfied that the matter is capable of being cured. Here, the problem with the directions were, firstly, they were to a juror who'd already demonstrated they would not comply with the oath. Secondly, those directions were given in the context of what was, by our calculations, a 5-day summing up, where there had been repeated references to the need to comply with the oath. And that, in one sense, means this just looked like a repeat of those directions. And those directions had been given in the circumstances where it would have been clear to the jury that the judge was concerned that they might be influenced by the fame of at least one of the defendants. And so the focus of those directions was, be cautious, you'll read a lot about this trial, essentially, but you'll be, and so there was essentially another direction, didn't expressly reference fame, but it was in the context of a situation where the judge was clearly expressing concerns about the impact of fame. In any event, as I say, we would say you can't give a direction that in circumstances where there is a risk of unconscious bias. It's very difficult to direct the jury in a way that will overcome that, if it's sufficiently embedded at least.
Why are we assuming it's unconscious bias? If every member of the jury has been approached and offered a bribe to acquit the defendants, I would think it was a quite conscious bias.
Well,
the jury would think, but the law does not think, that would be a relevant matter going to their guilt or innocence. But of course their job is to decide it in accordance with the evidence. Isn't the real problem here that it would be a temptation hard to resist to decide or to be influenced in the decision of the case by something other than the evidence presented to the court?
Well, to be clear, I'm not saying it wasn't conscious bias. What I'm dealing with, what I'm dealing with is, in one sense, my learned friend's submission, which is to say, you can trust the jury to comply with a direction that they should there is a problem with how detailed the direction was, but let's assume that the direction was sufficiently detailed. You can trust the jury to comply with a direction that they should disregard this factor. I mean, there's no reason in practice why it couldn't have said, because the jury were all meant to be aware of the bribe. I'm aware some of you have been approached about a bribe. You should now. The prosecution submission is you can trust the jury to comply with that. Whether that's realistic as a matter of human nature may be open to question. But assuming that's right, you still have the problem that even if a juror says to themselves, I understand that this looks pretty bad, that there was a bribe offered to us, but I understand what the judge has said, I need to put that out of my mind. It is very difficult, and this is why I'm focused on the unconscious bias aspect, it's very difficult as a matter of human nature to actually stop yourself unconsciously being influenced by that, because that's the way unconscious bias works. And that's why, is because I'm in one sense focusing on a particular difficulty that in our submission simply can't be addressed by a direction. But I accept that in reality, conscious bias is a very real problem here. Yes. Can I am in terms of just a couple of final features. Firstly, the procedure adopted. All we would invite the court to look at is, because my learned friend relies on it very heavily, Braithwaite 7358, the importance, in particular the citation at para 52 of an earlier case called Ball, the importance of matters being properly recorded in open court, which is the problem with the use of the forewoman, for example. That is important because it allows essentially assurance that there's been compliance with the correct approach.
There was a recording. It was transcribed.
But there was that, but not of the forewoman's communications with the jury. And so in Braithwaite, there was a lot of material that had been transcribed, but the problem was that there was a sort of private communication between judge and jury that hadn't. There was material that hadn't adequately been recorded. In terms of the retirement, very quickly, the bench book is clearly consolidating. The fact of the court, the approach of the Court of Appeal demonstrates they clearly believe that the judge wanted to and was entitled to try and get a verdict quickly, essentially, because of the problems that had arisen. That is a reflection, we would submit, of pressure being put on the jury. Finally, in terms of, I think a proviso I've probably already addressed, given my learned friend's submissions. In our submission, it's pretty clear the proviso can't apply. Retrial. One thing I'd wish to highlight about that, my learned friend's submissions yesterday about why the judge was entitled to adopt the approach he did, correctly and fairly pointed to the potential difficulties of a retrial in light of matters such as profile. Well, those difficulties have not diminished. They've become greater because of passage of time. This is something that's now high profile. In our submission, that submission supports our argument that there's no point remitting this because a fair trial is now very difficult, impossible, we would submit. That's right. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we're most grateful to all counsel who addressed us, and also to the people sitting behind who have no doubt contributed to what we've heard. We're very grateful. We'll now consider what's been said and consider what advice we shall humbly tender to His Majesty. The court will adjourn.
A big sound a play a big tune.
Ja oli Emmanuel I boy. Ja Gideon I'm a Gideon. The Gideon I'm a Gideon. The Gideon I'm a Gideon. Well, Gideon go busting out them head again. So much oppression poor people face right now. Them crying out for freedom. Them crying out for free speech. Then said them want to stand up like them black liberators, like Malcolm X and Martin Luther and the ancient monarchy where come pave the way, sir. Free up black people from me tear down them fence, yeah. Gideon, I'm a Gideon. The Gideon, I'm a Gideon. The Gideon, I'm a Gideon, well, the Gideon go busting out them head. I listen, I the power of the Trinity. Give us the teaching of His Majesty, and we know want no devil philosophy. Not until level for man's skin is of no more significant well to the color of his eye. Remember all the war done in 1935.
This is Sticky Stucky Sweet TV with Keith Gorgon. Good, healthy food with the X Factor. So give it a like, share, subscribe, and touch up that notification bell. And that is it. Look at